Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Curse of the Reaper by Brian Mcauley. Narrated by Altheide. Night of the Reaper, 1980. Script pages courtesy of Pinnacle Studios. Exterior, campfire, Ashland Summer Camp. Night. Camp Director Tim sits in front of the campfire, surrounded by a ring of teenaged counselors. Tim: "You guys know the legend, right?" Nerdy Sheila pushes her glasses up the bridge of her nose. Sheila: "What legend?" Tim: "The legend of why Ashland quit farming in the 50s, why they turned the cornfields into campgrounds. The land is cursed. The curse of the Reaper." Tough guy Axel flips out his switchblade, carving a stick to roast marshmallows. Axel: "What the hell's a Reaper?" Tim: "Not what. Who?" Tim leans toward the crackling flames. Tim: "His name was Lester Jensen, and his bloodline dated all the way back to this town's Danish founders. But Lester grew up an orphaned outcast, a mute who lived alone in an old abandoned barn and never spoke a word to anyone. Some people feared the man, but others hired him as their farmhand because he worked hard and never complained. Then, one year, a blight struck every crop. The corn didn't sprout, and the leaves just wilted and died on the stalk. Nobody knew why, but it didn't take long for the rumors to start swirling in town. A gust of wind howls through the circle as the counselors shiver and the fire flickers. Tim: "They said that Lester the Mute was practicing animal sacrifice out in that barn of his, that he brought on the blight by worshipping the devil. Folks worked themselves into a frenzy until that fateful harvest moon when they all decided Lester Jensen had to pay." Sheila: "What did they do to him?" Tim: "This God-fearing community went medieval, and the punishment for heresy meant getting dragged behind a horse into the village square to be dismembered in front of a cheering crowd. So Farmer Joe and his sons drove out to Lester's barn to bring him to justice. They tied a rusty chain to the back of their truck and dragged the accused heretic straight through the rotting cornfields toward town. Lester may have been a mute, but that night, everyone in Ashland could hear his cries echoing across the land." Axel twirls a blackening marshmallow on the end of his stick. Axel: "So, did they chop him up, or what?" Tim: "Never got a chance to, because at some point, that chain came loose. Farmer Joe and his sons, they spent all night searching the field for his body, but Lester Jensen was gone. And so was the rusty chain." Sheila: "You mean Lester survived?" Tim: "Some say he did. Some say he didn't. Either way, Lester came back for revenge." The next day, the town awakened to a stream of blood flowing down Main Street. They found 3 gruesome scarecrows hanging in the town square. It was Farmer Joe and his sons. They'd been hacked limb from limb and nailed back together in mismatched pieces, served up as a grisly message to the people of Ashland, a warning from the monster they now called the Reaper. A shudder ripples through the circle of teens. Tim: "And every harvest moon, just like tonight, they say he's out here, roaming in the dark where the cornfields used to be, hunting down trespassers and harvesting their souls. They say, if you listen closely, if it's very quiet, you can hear the distant clanking of his rusty chain." Silence falls upon the group, listening for any sound they can hear over the snaps and pops of logs between them. Axel: "Boo!" Axel jumps to his feet, scaring the other counselors as he laughs in their faces. Sheila: "That's not funny, Axel." Axel: "Oh, come on. Are you really scared that some freak farmhand is gonna—" Clank! A rusty chain whips out of the darkness, snapping around Axel's neck. He grasps at the metal links, eyes bulging until Crack! Axel's neck snaps, and his ragdoll body is yanked back into the shadows. The counselors are paralyzed in terror as the Reaper steps into the firelight. His shredded face oozes blood as ribbons of flesh hang above ragged overalls. He growls through shattered teeth, voice hoarse with gravel. The Reaper. Children of Ashland, it's time to reap what you've sown. The teens scream and scatter as the monster swings his rusty chain, cackling into the night as the blood harvest begins. Part 1. Resignation. Chapter 1.
What was your favorite kill?
Howard had been asked the question countless times over the years. With so many guttings and bludgeonings and dismemberments to choose from, he used to enjoy indulging his fans with a colorful selection from his resume of mayhem. But today, 15 years since his last lethal outing, he could no longer hide his weariness as he leaned on a rote response. My favorite kill is at the end of Part 4, the final reaping, when the Reaper himself is finally slain and burned to ashes. The balding fan on the other side of the table frowned, cracking the foundation of his homemade zombie makeup.
Yeah, but you came back.
Zombie Man pointed over Howard's shoulder, where posters for all 8 Night of the Reaper films hung on display in the cramped convention booth.
The Reaper always rises again.
Howard felt the weight of every flimsy poster, like another millstone around the neck of his sunken career, as he forced a nod. Indeed it does. Zombie Man grinned at the woman beside him, who blushed in her blood-stained prom dress.
My wife, she's too scared to ask,
he explained, holding up a digital camera.
But do you think she could get a photo with you?
Of course, Howard replied, accustomed to the request. That'll be $20. The exchange always felt a bit tacky, but he decided long ago that it was a matter of artistic principle to reinforce the worth of a professional actor's labor. The woman handed Howard a red-tinged bill as he stood beside her now, careful not to bump his freshly pressed slacks against her sticky dress. At 6'3", he was used to dwarfing most people with his slender frame as he hunched his head above her shoulder, adjusting his parted silver hair before giving a gentle smile for the camera. Zombie Man frowned again, lowering his lens.
Sorry, it's just... Could you...
Be the Reaper? Howard blushed. He sometimes forgot that it wasn't him the fans were coming to meet. It was the sinister slasher who punished countless teens for trespassing on his land through the entire decade of the 1980s. Howard never wore the Reaper's true face at these horror film conventions. But even without the marred flesh that would have taken 5 hours in a makeup chair to construct, he still knew how to give the fans their $20 worth. He wrapped his hands around the eager woman's neck for a faux choke, snarling the monster's rage toward the camera until Zombie Man finally snapped his photo with a gleeful giggle. The flash lingered in Howard's blurry vision as he released his death grip and the once silent wife leapt off her feet to plant a kiss on his freshly shaven cheek.
You're my favorite,
she breathily confessed.
Freddy and Jason are
scrubs. I know the Reaper could take them in a heartbeat. Howard offered a gracious, "Thank you," as he backed away from her starry eyes and returned safely behind the fold-up table. He knew not to engage with the diehard fans too deeply, lest he find himself with a stalker. Have a lovely weekend, you two. Howard dismissed Zombie Man and his bloody bride. As they skipped away together, hand in hand, he lowered himself back into the folding chair, arthritic knees creaking. His gaze fell now to the glossy publicity stills on the table, where his alter ego cast a mocking grin up at him, swinging the iconic rusty chain with eternal exuberance. Howard had signed thousands of these grotesque glamour shots over the years, so many that his right hand was now permanently cramped from gripping the black Sharpie as he scrawled, "Dear so-and-so, happy harvest, XX, the Reaper." It used to be that he hardly had time for a bathroom break, as his devotees flocked to conference centers all over the globe, lining up for hours just to meet their beloved monster. But there was no line now, as Howard looked up at the scattered attendees, moseying among a few dozen pop-up booths for other cult horror films. This happened to be a local event, which meant returning to the comfort of his own bed rather than suffering the night beneath a scratchy hotel bedspread. The thought of a warm bath beckoned, as he decided to call it an early day, packing his tote bag along with the conspicuously light envelope of $20 bills. As he lumbered toward the hotel conference room exit, a cleaning crew was already pushing their vacuums along the carpets. The stale smell of sweat seemed permanently soaked into these places, and Howard was desperate to breathe fresh air that hadn't been recycled through mouths that munched on microwaved snack bar pizza. A banner thanked him for attending Dead World Weekend 2005 as he stepped through the automatic doors of the airport Radisson into the warm Los Angeles spring. Peeling off the sweater he wore to combat the frigid air conditioning, he traversed the near-empty parking lot to his brown Cadillac DeVille. He tossed his tote bag in the trunk before easing behind the wheel and turning the ignition, only to be met with a resistant gurgle. "Come on, old gal," he begged as the hot sun beat through the windshield. "Not today." The car he'd proudly bought after the success of the first film was pushing over 200,000 miles now, but Howard wasn't ready to give up on her yet. Sure, the paint had faded from its original walnut shine into a dull rust tint, but he'd be damned if he ever traded her in for one of those shiny new electric monstrosities. Howard was all for saving the planet, but he resented a throwaway culture that discarded things before they'd lived out their full terms of purpose, always seeking some newer, sleeker model. After a few more persistent grinds, the engine finally grumbled to life. He exhaled with relief, reaching for the gear stick, only to find a post-it note there, with a reminder spelled out in his own careful cursive, "Cat food." Every time he came across one of these notes, he was reminded anew of Dr. Cho's recent diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. Howard resented her suggestion that he was already going senile and in need of such degrading mental assistance. But he couldn't deny that he'd been relying on these little yellow squares more and more of late. It seemed that warm bath would have to wait, as he plucked the post-it note from the shifter, steeling himself for the 2-hour odyssey of creeping crosstown traffic toward his neighborhood grocery store. As he rolled out of the lot, a departing plane roared overhead, sending a sweeping shadow over the asphalt like the specter of death itself, passing him by. By the time Howard arrived home, a purple dusk was settling over the old Victorian house at the end of the cul-de-sac. Nestled in the Altheide foothills, his home was just far enough from the madness of Hollywood to make it feel like living in the real world, which is exactly why he and Emma had chosen it. Ascending the porch steps now, he eyed the pair of Adirondack chairs where they used to share their morning tea. Flecks of white paint peeled from the sun-baked wood, as the chairs had long since fallen into disuse, but he just couldn't bring himself to throw them away. He half expected to open the front door now and find Emma waiting in the parlor, swaying to a Joni Mitchell record with a smile on her face. But as he entered the silent house, the only one coming to greet him in the foyer was Stanley. "Hello, my brute." Howard bent down to scratch his feline companion behind the ears. "You must be famished." He cracked the off-brand can of Frisky Whiskers, releasing a pungent odor into the air as he placed the tin on the hardwood floor. The black cat sniffed at the globby mixture and recoiled. "They were fresh out of Fancy Feast," Howard explained. "Don't be difficult, Stanley." The animal conceded, pecking at his subpar meal with a domestic displeasure befitting his namesake. Stanley Kowalski had been Howard's first starring role back at the conservatory when A Streetcar Named Desire was chosen for their graduate showcase. The violent character served as a formative challenge then for the bookish young actor. "Stage drama is not real life," his professor had told him. "It's more real than real life." The cordless phone rang to life on the end table as Howard shot across the hall to answer it. "This is Howard Browning." "Howie!" squawked the voice on the other end. There was only one person in the world who called Howard Howie, against consistent requests to the contrary. All Hollywood agents were trained to be schmoozy, but 25-year-old Jake Friedman was a bit too overzealous for someone who'd never landed his client an acting job. As soon as public appearances became Howard's primary occupation, the powers that be at Universal Talent Incorporated began shuffling him from one fledgling representative to another. "How's my favorite client?" asked the current incarnation of false enthusiasm. "Fine, Jacob." Howard twisted his vertebrae back into alignment. "Nice of you to return my call. 2 weeks later." "Sorry, buddy. It's been crazy. Pilot season and all that." "That's so." There was a time when Howard wouldn't dream of stooping to the level of televised dramas, but he couldn't help perking up now at the thought of all those new series with dozens of roles, fresh for the casting. "Anything you're sending me out for?" "Unless you can play a 20-something girl as smart as she is sexy," Jake said, "this may not be your season. But hey, if you're itching to act, I could give Lunatic Pictures a call back. See if they still want you for the mad scientist role in that zombie movie." No. Howard swatted away the suggestion. After being permanently typecast as a genre villain, the only offers that ever came down the pipeline were slight cameos in direct-to-video horror fare, and even those were few and far between. He'd made the mistake of taking such a job once about 10 years ago, still optimistic and eager to practice his craft again in earnest. Instead, he found himself trapped on a shoestring amateur production in rural Bulgaria, where he spent most of his days curled up on the outhouse floor with a crippling stomach bug. "I'm not that desperate," Howard said. "Damn straight," Jake responded. "That's because I've been busy booking your ass up and down the coast. How was Deathfest?" "Dead World," Howard corrected, carrying his tote bag down the hall. "What?" "Deathfest was last month in Sacramento," Howard explained. "This weekend is Dead World." Right. Death World. Still wrong. "So, how's it going?" "I'd say it's aptly named." Howard opened the cellar door and walked down the creaky steps into darkness. He tugged the cord of the swinging bulb as the light dimly illuminated an endless collection of Reaper memorabilia, packed onto shelves and spilling out into piles on the floor. Claustrophobia sunk in every time he came down here, crowded in by boxes of T-shirts and posters, cardboard standees and costume masks, action figures wielding tiny plastic chains, all preserved in pristine packaging. These collectibles only grew more extensive as the sequels got kitschier and the Reaper's hellish charisma earned him pop culture icon status. By the end of the 80s, the monster's image and quotable quips could be found plastered on everything from mugs and beach towels to lunchboxes and watches. Howard sold what he could at conventions and stashed the rest here, in this defunct Reaper museum with no curator. He dropped his tote bag onto the closest pile of basement detritus, next to a blood-stained basketball. This notable gem was from the '86 Bulls halftime show, where he appeared in full makeup to promote Part 6, Urban Harvest. He still couldn't believe he'd sunk that free throw over the sound of the arena's electric roar. Thousands of voices chanting as their energy pulsed through his fingertips. "Reaper, Reaper, Reaper." "So, what do you need?" Jake chirped through the phone, shaking him from the visceral reverie. "More publicity stills? I could check with the studio, see if they've got anything stowed away." "No, I have plenty of photos. That's the problem. I hardly signed half a stack today, and I don't even bother lugging the memorabilia anymore. The fans just aren't coming out the way they used to." Howard suspected the cause for this decline in attendance could be summed up in one word: Internet. Conventions used to be the only place that like-minded oddballs could congregate, but now instant gratification outlets for fandom were found online. These virtual forums might scratch a temporary itch, but Howard still believed that there was simply no substitute for flesh-and-blood human interaction. "You short on cash, Howie?" Jake asked. "Times are tight for everyone right now, but if you want to hold on to my 10% of the autograph cash from this weekend, I'd do that for you, buddy. You know I take care of you." Howard resisted pointing out what a generous sacrifice that $40 would be, as making such a petty jab would have required admitting just how thin his collections had been. "I appreciate that, Jacob, but it's not about the money. I'm just not sure who I'm doing this for anymore. And I'm tired," Howard finally admitted, still slightly out of breath from descending the cellar steps. "Perhaps it's time I called it quits." His 65th birthday had passed quietly, like any other day, save for the letter he received from the Screen Actors Guild, congratulating him on reaching the union's standard retirement age. The pension benefits could easily cover his modest lifestyle for years to come. But the question remained what he would do with himself if he embraced true retirement. As much as these conventions were wearing him down, they at least provided some semblance of structure and purpose to his otherwise empty days. "I know the circuit's a grind, and turnout can be hit or miss," Jake responded with strained empathy, having never attended a convention with Howard before. "But don't forget we've got HorrorCon 05 just around the corner. The Reaper heads will be coming out in the thousands for that one, and you can't quit on them now, Howie. I mean, a Lifetime Achievement Award is a serious honor." "Yes." Howard's eyes caught on a collectible tin lunchbox in the corner, an image of the Reaper impaling a victim through the mouth with an ear of corn, as the speech bubble read, "Eat your veggies." "A serious honor." "Listen, I've got to hop off for another call right now, but let's just focus on one convention at a time. You give 'em hell at Death Fest this weekend, and we'll touch base before the next one, all right?" "All right. Catch you later, Howie." The line went dead before Howard could utter a response. Staring at the heaps of pop culture relics collecting dust in a dank cellar, he was reminded of his favorite Shelley poem. "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings," the epitaph of that arrogant emperor read. "Look upon my works, ye mighty, and despair." But his statue lay shattered and forgotten in the vast desert, as the narrator observed, nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. Howard looked upon his own wreckage now, with the cold realization that this wasn't a museum. No. This was a graveyard. A tomb. He reached up to tug the light bulb cord, casting his haunted history back into darkness, as the future grew fainter than ever. Chapter 2. Howard wasn't sure where the night had gone as he pulled up to the airport Radisson the next morning. He never did take that warm bath, having fallen asleep in the parlor chair with Stanley curled in his lap. Groggily awakening to daylight with Dostoevsky's Demons open on his chest, he'd found himself uncharacteristically late. On top of that, there was hardly a free space in the lot this morning, likely airport overflow on a popular weekend travel day. When he finally found a spot, some distance from the hotel entrance, he wished he hadn't skipped his usual English breakfast tea. He'd long given up coffee, finding that it rattled his nerves to the point where he couldn't keep the Sharpie steady. But he yearned for some kind of artificial pep now, as he climbed out of his car. Voicing his fatigue to Jake had only cemented his awareness of it, as he popped the trunk and stared at his tote bag full of publicity stills. Perhaps he should just play hooky today. Get in his car and drive away before Howard fucking Browning. The hoarse voice muttered inches from his ear as a hand clamped down on his shoulder. Howard shuddered, having thought himself well past the days of fans rushing him in the parking lot. But as he turned toward his accoster, he was surprised to find a familiar woman's face, weathered behind thick black glasses and topped with a white crew cut. "Joan," Howard breathed through a relieved smile.
"Christ, it's good to see you."
Joan gave a tobacco-stained grin as she pulled Howard in for a hug against her green army jacket. The smell of Parliament cigarettes wafting from her clothing brought Howard right back to Joan's makeup chair. He'd sit on her throne for hours every shoot day while she painstakingly crafted the Reaper's grisly visage, regaling him with stories from her past life as a Vietnam War combat photographer. There weren't many women on the front lines in those days, let alone openly gay women, but Jersey Joan was an army brat who could hold her own with the foul-mouthed grunts. She also snuck her fair share of passionate trysts with lonely nurses when she wasn't documenting the visceral devastation that would someday inspire her gory special effects wizardry. Joan's work on the Reaper's gruesome demise in Part 4 rightfully won her a Fexie Award. But it had been years since Howard had seen his old friend on the convention circuit. As he finally released from the hug, he realized it was the first physical human contact he'd had in some time, outside of awkwardly staged photo ops. "I had no idea you were on the schedule," Howard said.
"I wasn't. They're doing this special effects panel. Wanted to have the old guard chatting with the new," Joan explained, lighting a fresh cigarette. "Marty Brogan was supposed to be on it. You remember Marty, right?"
"Of course. He designed the Reaper spawn for Part 7. Seed of the Reaper was Howard's least favorite entry in the series, starting with the problematic dream rape sequence and culminating in the birth of the baby Reaper. Marty was nothing if not creative, but the rusty chain umbilical cord was a particularly misguided touch.
"Well, he dropped dead last week," Joan puffed. "Heart attack. Face first and a plate of eggs right in front of his poor wife."
"That's awful," Howard replied. Awful, but not uncommon. He couldn't help noticing that many ailments of old age were starting to pick off his cinematic comrades one by one, like the victims of their films.
"Anyway," Joan explained, "they asked me to fill in, and I figured screw it. Might be fun to jump back into the trenches for a day. It's a trip doing these things every now and then, don't you think?"
"Oh, yes." Howard finally turned to close the trunk and hide his blushing face. "Every now and then." He deftly changed the subject as he motioned to the canvas duffel bag over Joan's shoulder. "Which one did you bring today?" Joan dug into the bag, unearthing a severed silicone head with its mouth agape in death. The flesh-colored paint was chipping away, but it still looked remarkably convincing, with the glistening red splatter at the torn neck giving it that wet feel. "Ah," Howard grinned. "Part 3, wasn't it? Fields of Blood? I believe the poor fellow's name was Brad?" Joan shrugged.
"Who remembers the names?"
"Well, as I recall, the Reaper only tore Brad's head off after giving it a good squeeze." Howard grinned. "So, let's see the real effect, maestro." It was Joan who blushed now, embarrassed of her own work, as she reached for a small hand pump attached to the air tube that ran up the back of the severed head. Joan gave the pump a hard squeeze, sending Brad's left eyeball popping out of the socket to hang by stringy red tendons. Howard let out an amused laugh as Joan muttered,
"Old dog, old tricks."
"You invented the tricks," Howard noted as they began their walk to the hotel. "How have you been? Last we spoke, you were opening a military supply store?"
"Army-Navy, yeah,"
Joan replied.
"Business ain't exactly booming. Mostly just obnoxious hipsters looking for vintage T-shirts. But it keeps me busy, you know. At my age, that's all I can really ask for. Especially with these son-of-a-bitchin' cataracts."
She motioned to the cloudy eyes behind her glasses.
"What about you? Still in the acting game?"
"Yes, of course. Busy as ever," Howard responded on reflex, hoping the quick lie wasn't too obvious.
"Glad to hear it."
Joan smiled, tossing her cigarette butt as she motioned to the Dead World Weekend 2005 banner over the hotel entrance.
"You ready to face the fiends?"
"If today's anything like yesterday, I'm afraid we're in for a rather quiet one."
"Suits me. It'll give us more time to catch up."
Joan gave him a sturdy pat on the back. "I'd like that, Joan. Very much." Howard replied with a grateful smile. The automatic doors whirred open as the sound of a clamoring crowd engulfed them. The place was packed. Hundreds of people milling about, far more than yesterday.
"Quiet my ass,"
Joan muttered. Howard was stunned, searching for some explanation. "Perhaps there's a memorial for Marty?"
"Perhaps,"
Joan playfully echoed.
"Catch you later, Fraser."
Joan walked off as Howard headed in the direction of his booth, squeezing his way through the throng of masked monsters. The closer he got, the more he saw that the masses were forming into a line, stretching all the way along the wall, rounding a corner and continuing onward. What were they all lined up for? Had the snack bar just restocked with microwaved pizza? Heads began to turn toward him, whispering and murmuring with a building excitement as he noticed that their attire was becoming more uniform. The T-shirts and masks and swinging plastic chains. These were Reaper fans. Howard finally arrived at his little fold-up table to see that it was all leading here. This crowd was here for him, and they began to cheer now at the sight of him. He gave a confused smile as Jake emerged from the makeshift curtain behind the booth, wearing a suit that was 2 sizes too big, as he talked into his cellular phone.
"Yes, sir."
Jake stuttered, wiping the
Sample complete. Ready to continue?